On a cold February night in 2005, 26-year-old Susan Ambrosino disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a young daughter and a web of lies that would unravel in the most unexpected way. What began as a routine evening would soon become the foundation of a chilling mystery that would haunt those closest to her. But who was behind her brutal murder? Was it someone she trusted, or someone close enough to destroy everything she held dear? What secrets lay buried between Susan and her ex-husband's brother, Steven Schiovone? How did a seemingly harmless family feud spiral into one of New York's most chilling crimes? As the investigation deepened, the answers became more complex and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Susan Ambrosino, a 26-year-old woman from Franklin Square, New York, had endured the difficult and often painful process of rebuilding her life after a divorce. In 2005, she was adjusting to a new chapter, far from the turmoil of her past. She had a daughter, Taylor, an 8-year-old girl who was her world, and though Susan had faced numerous challenges in her personal life, she always made sure Taylor felt safe and loved. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Susan's life seemed to be on an upward trajectory. On the night of February 22, 2005, Susan's routine would be shattered. She had planned to meet her ex-husband's half-brother, Steven Schiovone, and her former spouse, Keith Ambrosino. It was to be a casual meeting at a pizza restaurant, one that seemed unremarkable at first glance. Susan had not been in contact with Keith for some time, but the nature of their relationship remained complex. The divorce had left wounds, but the two continued to share a history, and their daughter was forever a bridge between them. Susan had made arrangements for Taylor to stay with a babysitter that evening, as was her custom when she needed time to herself. That was the last time Taylor would see her mother. Susan did not return that night, and by the early hours of February 23rd, her family was growing increasingly concerned. It was out of character for Susan to leave her daughter behind without any communication, especially when Taylor had been eagerly awaiting her return. At around 3 a.m., with no word from Susan, her family filed a missing person report. Her brother, Anthony Napolitano, was among the first to react. The absence of Susan was completely out of place. "We all knew right away that was very wrong of Susan to not come home to her daughter," Anthony would later say, his words betraying the confusion and fear that gripped their family. The call to the police was not just a precaution, but an urgent plea for help. Something was terribly wrong. Keith Ambrosino and his half-brother, Steven Schiovone, shared a history rooted in the complexities of family dynamics. Their relationship, strained even before the disappearance of Susan Ambrosino, had been one of constant tension, fueled by jealousy and an underlying sense of rivalry. Keith, who had spent years away from New York due to his military service, returned to find his brother had grown closer to his ex-wife, Susan, and his daughter, Taylor. The seeds of animosity were sown long before Susan's tragic disappearance. When Keith left for Colorado in the late 1990s, it was Steven who became the pillar of support for Susan and Taylor. While Keith focused on his career, Steven stepped in to help where needed, becoming a father figure to Taylor, a role that seemed to come naturally to him. He would fix things around the house, help with daily tasks, and often spend time with Susan, becoming a reliable presence in their lives. Keith, during his years in Colorado, had no idea just how integral Steven had become in the lives of his family. But as time passed, it became increasingly clear to Keith that things had shifted. Susan and Taylor, in his absence, had grown close to Steven, and this relationship was more than just a friendship. It was one that seemed to replace the role Keith once held. This was not a revelation that Keith welcomed. As his resentment grew, so did the distance between him and his brother. Upon Keith's return to New York in 2004, the tensions between the two men escalated. Keith learned of the closeness between Steven and his family and the role Steven had played in raising Taylor. The fact that Steven had stepped into the fatherly role, especially in Keith's absence, was something that Keith struggled to accept. It seemed as though his own brother had stolen the place he had once occupied in his daughter's life. This knowledge gnawed at him, and the realization that Steven was now deeply embedded in his ex-wife's life only fueled his anger further. The rivalry between the brothers was a complex and bitter one. At its core, it was not just about family dynamics. It was about identity and loss. Keith, having returned from Colorado, now found himself fighting not just for his daughter's attention, but also for a place in Susan's life that had long since been replaced by Steven. The lines between love, loyalty, and resentment began to blur, and the cracks in their relationship deepened. As the months wore on, the tension between the brothers became more evident. Susan, caught between two men who were once family, was often caught in the middle of their disagreements. Her role as a mother and as a woman navigating the complexities of divorce made her vulnerable. Susan needed support, but the support she received was often tinged with jealousy and manipulation, especially from Steven. By the time Susan and Steven met on the night of February 22, 2005, their relationship had taken a darker turn. While Keith remained an emotionally distant figure in Susan's life, Steven had become an ever-present force. Though Susan had made efforts to distance herself from the chaos of her past, she found herself once again swept into the whirlwind of unresolved emotions, secrets, and unspoken desires. The tension that had been simmering for years would now come to a head in the most tragic of ways. The night before Susan disappeared, she had arranged to meet Steven, her ex-husband's half-brother, for a casual dinner. What was supposed to be a simple, innocent gathering became the final chapter in a complex and devastating family drama. For Susan, there was a sense of finality to the evening, a sense that the events of that night would somehow change the course of her life. But what Susan did not know was that the gathering would also be the beginning of the unraveling of her own fate. According to the details later revealed by her brother, Anthony Napolitano, Susan had made a phone call to Keith earlier in the day, informing him that she had something important to share. She said she had information that would change their lives forever, Anthony recounted in a later interview. But as the hours passed and Susan failed to return home, the gravity of her words began to settle in the minds of her family. What had she meant by this cryptic statement? And why had she been so secretive about it? These questions lingered in the air, unanswered. As Susan's family waited for any sign of her, Anthony began to piece together the fragments of their lives. He knew that Susan had been struggling with the tension between Keith and Steven, but he had no idea how deeply it had affected her. The family had always known that there was friction between the brothers, but it was not until after Susan's disappearance that the extent of the problem became clear. Anthony would later admit that he had long been concerned about Susan's relationships with both men, particularly with Steven. She was always trying to keep the peace between them, but it wasn't working, he would say. Steven's relationship with Susan, as it turned out, was far more complicated than anyone had known. Not only had he stepped in as a father figure to Taylor, but he had also been involved in a secret and illicit relationship with Susan. It was revealed that Susan had been pregnant at the time of her disappearance, and the father of her unborn child was none other than Steven. The revelation sent shockwaves through the family. Anthony Napolitano, Susan's brother, was particularly stunned by the news. "I didn't even know she was seeing anyone," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Who's the father?" She said it was Steven. The revelation of Susan's pregnancy added a dark layer to the already tense situation. Keith, who had been unaware of the relationship between his ex-wife and his half-brother, was devastated. He had no idea that Steven had been so involved in Susan's life, let alone her most intimate moments. The discovery of the pregnancy was a revelation that would send the investigation into a new direction, and soon all the pieces began to fall into place. The dynamics between Keith, Steven, and Susan were far from simple. Their complex relationships, fueled by jealousy, betrayal, and unspoken emotions, had created a toxic environment that ultimately led to Susan's tragic fate. For Steven, the secret of Susan's pregnancy, combined with his ongoing relationship with his girlfriend Kim, had created an impossible situation. As the investigation into Susan's disappearance deepened, the truth about Steven's involvement in her death became increasingly undeniable. Keith and Steven's rivalry, once a background noise in the family, had now become the central force that drove the tragic events of February 22, 2005. The emotional toll on Susan, caught between two men who could no longer coexist, was immeasurable. And in the end, it was that very rivalry that led to the loss of a life, one that had once been filled with hope, dreams, and the promise of a new beginning. The search for Susan Ambrosino had stretched through the cold night and into the following day, but still there was no sign of her. As the hours passed, the hope for a peaceful resolution to the case dimmed, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Family members, particularly her brother Anthony Napolitano, were becoming increasingly frantic, fearing the worst. Susan had not been known to disappear without a trace, especially not without contacting her daughter, Taylor, or leaving any word behind. The question now wasn't where she was, it was what had happened to her and why. Then, as the investigation intensified, a breakthrough came. More than 24 hours after her disappearance, a shocking discovery would change everything. Around 7 p.m. on February 23, 2005, a passerby found Susan's purse in a vacant lot 6 miles from her home in Queens, New York. The scene was puzzling and unsettling, far from where anyone would expect her to be. Her purse, a personal belonging so closely tied to her, was the first tangible clue that something was terribly wrong. The discovery alone was troubling, but it was only the beginning of what would soon be revealed. Not far from the location of her purse, her car was found, abandoned like an eerie marker in a place no one could explain. The car was locked, yet it was filled with troubling signs. The bloodstains in the passenger seat painted a grim picture, suggesting violence had taken place inside the vehicle. Whoever had been in that car had been hurt, possibly badly. But this discovery still didn't answer the most pressing question. Where was Susan? And more importantly, what had led to her disappearance? It wasn't until the trunk of the car was opened that the full extent of the tragedy became clear. There, lying lifeless, was Susan's body. The discovery of her corpse brought an end to the search, but it also opened up a new set of questions. What had happened to her in those final moments? How had she come to be left in the trunk of her own car, a victim of a brutal crime? The scene told a story, a horrifying one that no one had anticipated. Susan, once a young woman full of potential and hope, had been shot in the head, her life violently snuffed out. It was clear that this was no accident, no simple disappearance. This was murder. The blood in the passenger seat, the purse abandoned in the lot, and the body in the trunk all pointed to a deliberate act of violence, one that seemed to have unfolded quickly and without warning. As the authorities began to piece together the timeline of events leading up to Susan's death, a chilling realization began to emerge. The discovery of Susan's body was not the end of the mystery. Rather, it was the key to unlocking a web of secrets and lies that had been hidden just beneath the surface. In particular, one crucial detail began to surface. Susan had been pregnant. This revelation, though shocking in itself, added layers of complexity to the case. The fact that Susan had been carrying a child was a turning point in the investigation. It would explain the sense of urgency in her final phone call to Keith Ambrosino, the call where she had told him that she had something to share with him that would change their lives forever. She had been carrying a child, and it was not just any child. The father, as it would later be revealed, was none other than Steven Schiovone, her ex-husband's half-brother. This fact added a new dimension to the tragedy. Susan had been pregnant with the child of the very man who would become her killer. The discovery of the pregnancy raised a crucial question. Was this the motive behind Susan's murder? What had Steven's feelings been upon learning that Susan was pregnant? And how had his involvement with her, both emotionally and physically, influenced the tragic events that followed? The possibility of an unwanted pregnancy, coupled with the tension between Steven and his brother Keith, created a volatile mix, one that could have fueled Steven's dark actions. Steven, for his part, had been in a relationship with his girlfriend, Kim, at the time. Kim was also pregnant, making the timing of Susan's pregnancy all the more significant. The dual pregnancies, the one Steven had with Kim and the one he had with Susan, created a situation that was impossible to ignore. The complexity of Steven's life, torn between two women both carrying his children, was a significant factor in the unfolding tragedy. This was not simply a case of a love triangle. It was a tangled mess of emotions, deceit, and betrayal that would eventually lead to murder. The more investigators learned about Steven's relationship with Susan, the more questions arose. How had he felt about the pregnancy? What had driven him to murder Susan, the mother of his child? Was it jealousy, fear, or something more calculated? The investigation would eventually reveal that Steven was not happy about Susan's pregnancy. He did not want the child, and he was unwilling to face the consequences of his actions. This was a man who had built a life with his girlfriend, Kim, and now the reality of Susan's pregnancy threatened to destroy the life he had carefully constructed. As the investigation unfolded, Steven's story became more inconsistent. Initially, he had claimed to have met Susan at the pizza place and left without incident. However, as the police examined his movements more closely, they discovered contradictions in his alibi. Cell phone records revealed that Steven had been in contact with his girlfriend's brother Tim at the same time he claimed to have been alone, watching television. This inconsistency would come to haunt him. When Tim finally admitted to the police that Steven had called him for a ride near the location where Susan's body was discovered, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Steven's failure to provide a credible alibi and the mounting evidence against him eventually led to his downfall. The gun used to kill Susan was later traced back to him, further cementing his role in the crime. His guilt could no longer be denied. As the case came to its tragic conclusion, the true motive for Susan's murder became clear. It was a combination of fear, jealousy, and a desperate attempt to cover up his involvement with Susan. The discovery of her pregnancy, the tension between Steven and his brother Keith, and the web of lies he had woven around his relationships all came together to form the tragic end to Susan's life. In the end, Steven Schiovone's actions were driven by a deep-seated fear of losing everything. But in the process, he lost far more than he could have ever imagined. The murder of Susan Ambrosino was not just a senseless crime. It was the product of a broken family, filled with secrets, betrayals, and unresolved emotions. The consequences of Steven's actions would haunt him for the rest of his life, and the family he left behind would never be the same. The investigation into the death of Susan Ambrosino began with more questions than answers. From the moment her body was found, the authorities knew they were dealing with a case far more complex than a simple disappearance. At the center of it all was Steven Schiovone, the man Susan had trusted, the one who had been a constant presence in her life. And yet, it was becoming increasingly clear that Steven's version of events didn't add up. His alibi, simple and straightforward on the surface, was about to fall apart. Steven had initially told detectives that, after meeting with Susan at the pizza restaurant, he had gone home, where he claimed he spent the evening watching television with his girlfriend's brother Tim. It was a statement that seemed plausible, but something in his story felt off. Investigators, determined to uncover the truth, began to piece together the evidence with relentless precision. Cell phone records, a tool the detectives knew would provide critical insight, were soon analyzed. As the investigation progressed, it became evident that Steven's account of the night was not as solid as he had believed. The records showed that his phone had been in constant communication with Tim's phone during the time he claimed to be sitting quietly at home. Detectives quickly realized that two people, supposedly sitting together in a quiet room watching television, would not have been exchanging dozens of phone calls. The inconsistencies in Steven's alibi were the first cracks in his carefully constructed story. As the hours passed, the case began to take shape. The truth, buried beneath layers of lies, was slowly emerging. The detectives dug deeper, questioning Steven's relationship with Susan and his motives. It became apparent that Steven's connection to Susan was far more complicated than anyone had previously imagined. The realization that Susan had been pregnant with his child added another layer to the mystery. Steven had not only been involved with Susan, but he had also been hiding a second secret, one that would prove to be just as devastating. At the same time, investigators learned that Steven's girlfriend, Kim, was also pregnant with his child. The timing of the pregnancies, just weeks apart, raised even more suspicions. How could Steven have been involved with both women? one his ex-wife's half-sister, the other his longtime girlfriend, without the situation unraveling. The detectives soon realized that Steven's life had become a tangled mess of deceit. His lies were not just about Susan's death. They were about his relationships, his motivations, and his attempts to maintain control over a life that was quickly slipping away. As more details about Steven's life came to light, the detectives began to understand the depth of the web he had woven. The hidden relationships, the manipulation, the fear of losing everything, all pointed to a man who had become increasingly desperate. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Susan's death had been driven by a need to control a situation that had spiraled out of control. The pregnancy, the rivalry with his brother, Keith, and the complexity of his romantic entanglements had pushed Steven to the edge. The most significant breakthrough came when detectives turned their attention to Tim, Steven's alibi. The man who had supposedly been with Steven that night, the one who corroborated his story, had begun to feel the pressure. As investigators closed in, Tim cracked. He admitted that he had been lying about the evening's events. According to Tim, Steven had called him that night, asking him to pick him up near the location where Susan's body was eventually discovered. It was the piece of the puzzle that had been missing. Steven had lied, and his alibi was now completely shattered. But Tim's revelation didn't stop there. He went on to explain that Steven had asked him to hold on to a gun, one that he later turned over to police. The gun, once tested, was found to be a ballistic match for the weapon used to kill Susan. The evidence against Steven was undeniable. He had not only lied about his whereabouts that night, but he had also attempted to cover up his involvement in the crime by enlisting the help of a close friend. The lies had started to unravel, and with them, Steven's facade of innocence began to crumble. As the case continued to unfold, new twists emerged. The police began to piece together the events of that night, filling in the gaps with chilling precision. Steven had been caught in a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal. His attempts to protect himself had only exposed the truth more clearly. The detectives, with each new piece of evidence, moved closer to the heart of the crime. The investigation was no longer about figuring out who had killed Susan. It was about understanding why. The motive for Susan's murder had slowly come into focus. The pregnancy had been the tipping point, the event that had caused Steven to snap. He had been living a double life, one with his girlfriend, Kim, and another with Susan. The arrival of Susan's pregnancy had threatened everything he had built with Kim. Unable to reconcile the two worlds, Steven had resorted to murder, silencing the one person who had the power to expose him. But it wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about control, about maintaining a life that Steven had crafted, no matter the cost. In his mind, Susan's pregnancy and the potential consequences for his future were simply too much to bear. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when the authorities discovered that Steven had tried to cover up the crime by manipulating his alibi. The evidence, however, painted a clear and undeniable picture. He had tried to hide the truth, to deflect suspicion, but it was too late. The lies he had told about his whereabouts, about his relationships, about the gun, were exposed for what they truly were. Desperate attempts to maintain control over a situation that had spiraled beyond his grasp. As the detectives pieced together the full extent of Steven's lies, the case became more than just a murder investigation. It was the story of a man whose life had become a series of increasingly complex lies. And when those lies were exposed, they led to the devastating loss of a mother, a daughter, and a family torn apart by betrayal. The unraveling of Steven's alibi and his lies was a moment of reckoning, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, had come to light. And with it came the painful realization that the very man who had once been trusted as a father figure had become the one responsible for the most horrifying betrayal of all. As the investigation into Susan Ambrosino's death drew to a close, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place, but one lingering question remained. Why? Why had Steven Schiovone, a man once trusted by Susan and her family, committed such an unspeakable act? The evidence was overwhelming, but it was not until the weight of the truth became inescapable that Steven's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. For days, Steven had denied any involvement in Susan's murder. His alibi, built on the claim that he had been at home with his girlfriend's brother, had already fallen apart. Cell phone records had shattered his story, revealing the countless calls exchanged between him and Tim during the evening. The gun found in Tim's possession, the weapon used to kill Susan, further solidified Steven's connection to the crime. Still, he had not confessed. He had continued to deny his involvement, even as the evidence mounted against him. But then, in a dramatic turn of events, everything changed. The pressure of the investigation, the undeniable evidence, and the relentless pursuit of the truth took their toll. Confronted with the facts, Steven had no choice but to admit what he had done. He confessed to manslaughter, not murder, but his admission was still a shocking moment of clarity. The confession, while a resolution in one sense, opened up a flood of new questions. The truth was now out, but the questions surrounding Steven's motive lingered in the air. Why had he done it? What had pushed him, a man who had been so deeply embedded in Susan's life, to kill her? Was it the pregnancy, the tension between the brothers, or was there something more, something deeper, that had led him to this point? As the detectives worked to piece together the full scope of Steven's confession, they began to understand that the true story of Susan's death was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Steven's admission of manslaughter was not the full story. It was only a fragment of the truth. His confession, while relieving in some ways, still left much to be uncovered. The details of what had transpired on that fateful night were still shrouded in mystery. What Steven had not yet revealed, however, was the true extent of the emotional turmoil he had been facing. The pressure of balancing two pregnancies, one with his longtime girlfriend, Kim, and the other with Susan, had created an unsustainable situation. Steven, already struggling with jealousy and resentment, was now faced with the consequences of his actions. He could not maintain the life he had built with Kim and at the same time be the father of Susan's child. The weight of this contradiction drove him to a breaking point, one that he could not escape. Steven's deep-seated fears, his resentment toward his brother Keith, and the overwhelming pressure of his double life had converged in that moment of violence. His murder of Susan was not premeditated in the traditional sense. Rather, it was the result of an emotional breakdown, a moment of complete loss of control. The act itself, though brutal, was not born out of a calculated desire to hurt. It was the desperate, impulsive reaction of a man who saw his life slipping away. As the confession unfolded, Steven explained his actions in a way that seemed almost detached, as though he were recounting the events from a distance. His words lacked the emotion one might expect from someone who had just admitted to taking another person's life. And yet, beneath the surface, there was a chilling truth. Steven had been willing to sacrifice everything to preserve the life he had carefully constructed with Kim, even if it meant destroying the very family he had once been a part of. The tragic irony of the situation was not lost on the investigators. Steven had murdered Susan, the mother of his child, in an attempt to protect the future he had built with Kim. But in doing so, he had destroyed everything: his relationship with his family, his reputation, and his future. What he had hoped to protect had been torn apart, leaving nothing but the ruins of a life defined by lies and betrayal. As the investigation moved forward, the full impact of Steven's actions began to sink in. Susan's family, already reeling from the loss of their loved one, was now left to grapple with the revelation of what had truly happened. The shock of Steven's confession was compounded by the knowledge that he had been so deeply involved in their lives, trusted by all, and yet capable of committing such a heinous act. Keith Ambrosino, Susan's ex-husband, struggled to understand what had driven Steven to murder his former wife. The bond between the two men, already strained by years of rivalry, had now been shattered in the most irreversible way. For Keith, the pain of losing Susan was compounded by the betrayal he felt at the hands of his own brother. The relationship between Keith and Steven had been one of competition, jealousy, and unresolved tensions, but never had Keith imagined that it would culminate in murder. For Taylor Ambrosino, Susan's young daughter, the truth was even harder to process. The man who had once been a father figure to her, who had stepped in when her biological father had not, was now revealed to be the one who had taken her mother's life. The emotional impact of this revelation would be felt for years to come. The questions that Taylor would carry with her about why and how her mother had been killed would haunt her for the rest of her life. The family's grief was compounded by the knowledge that Steven's actions had not only robbed them of Susan, but had also torn apart the very fabric of their family. The web of lies, jealousy, and betrayal that had led to Susan's death was now exposed for all to see. The consequences of Steven's choices were far-reaching, touching everyone involved, from Susan's family to his own. As the investigation continued and Steven's trial began, the lingering questions about motive and the true nature of his relationship with Susan and Keith continued to haunt the case. Steven had confessed to manslaughter, but what had truly driven him to kill? Was it the pregnancy, the rivalry with his brother, or was it something more, a deep-seated need to control a life that was slipping away from him? The resolution of Steven's confession did little to ease the pain felt by those left behind. The impact of Susan's death and the role Steven played in it would be felt for years to come. The finality of Steven's confession did not bring closure. It only left a trail of devastation that could never be undone. For Susan's family, the questions would remain unanswered, and the pain of her loss would linger, a reminder of the complexities of family, betrayal, and the tragic consequences of unresolved emotions. As the dust settled on the investigation into the murder of Susan Ambrosino, the stark reality of the impact on her family became painfully clear. The case, though brought to a conclusion with Steven Schiavone's confession, left behind a trail of devastation that could never truly be undone. The toll of the crime was felt most acutely by those who had loved her, the people who had trusted Steven, the man who had once been considered family, only to have that trust shattered in the most unimaginable way. For Taylor Ambrosino, Susan's 8-year-old daughter, the psychological impact was profound and long-lasting. Taylor had always known Steven as a father figure. He had stepped into her life during a time when her biological father, Keith, was absent, providing her with a sense of stability. To her, Steven had been the one who showed up, the one who was there when she needed guidance, when she needed comfort. But with the revelation that Steven was responsible for her mother's death, Taylor was left to grapple with a harrowing contradiction. The man who had been a source of security had now become the one who had destroyed everything. The loss of Susan, the only parent she had known, was a trauma that would shape Taylor's entire life. The psychological toll on Taylor was compounded by the betrayal she would feel for years to come. The images of her mother's brutal death, the sudden loss of the woman who had given her life, would haunt her. And the fact that Steven, a man she had once trusted, was the one who had taken her mother from her, only added to the confusion and grief. How could she reconcile the loving uncle, the man who had helped raise her, with the cold-blooded killer responsible for her mother's murder? But Taylor was not the only one affected by the tragic loss of Susan. The impact on Susan's family extended far beyond the immediate shock of her death. For Anthony Napolitano, Susan's brother, the sense of betrayal was devastating. Anthony had always known Steven as a part of their family, and to have him turn out to be the one responsible for Susan's death was a betrayal he could not easily comprehend. He would later speak about the confusion he felt, saying how he had never imagined that Steven could be capable of such an act. His pain, however, was not just rooted in the loss of his sister. It was in the realization that someone they had welcomed into their lives with open arms had caused such a profound rupture in their family. For Keith Ambrosino, Susan's ex-husband, the psychological toll was also immense. Though the relationship between Keith and Susan had been complicated, marked by years of estrangement and an attempt to reconnect, it had still been a relationship rooted in shared history and responsibility. Keith had once been married to Susan, and they had shared a child. To learn that Steven, his own half-brother, had taken Susan's life was a blow that cut deeper than any he had experienced before. The emotional weight of the tragedy was immense, and the feelings of betrayal and grief were compounded by the fact that the person who had betrayed him most deeply was not a stranger, but someone who had once been a part of his family. The emotional devastation for Keith was not just in losing Susan, but in losing his relationship with Steven in the most irreversible way. The consequences of Steven's actions were far-reaching. He had not only taken Susan's life, but had destroyed the delicate fabric of a family that had already been fractured by years of tension and unresolved conflict. What Steven had failed to understand was the depth of the connections he had severed in his pursuit of control. In attempting to protect the life he had built with Kim, he had lost everything he had once cherished. His actions had shattered the lives of his family members, leaving behind a trail of psychological scars that would take years to heal, if ever. The community, too, felt the shockwaves of the crime. Susan had been a woman who had worked hard to rebuild her life after a painful divorce, a woman who had put her daughter first in everything she did. To lose her in such a violent way left everyone who knew her grappling with a sense of disbelief. How could someone so close to her, someone trusted by her family, be capable of taking her life? The loss was not just a personal one for her loved ones. It was a communal loss, a tragedy that rippled through everyone who had known her. As Steven was sentenced to 30 years in prison, the damage had already been done. The weight of his actions could not be undone, and no number of years behind bars would ever be enough to heal the wounds he had caused. His confession, while bringing some semblance of closure to the case, did little to alleviate the pain of those left behind. Taylor, Anthony, and Keith were all left to grapple with the aftermath of Susan's death, struggling with the complex emotions of grief, betrayal, and loss. The psychological toll on Taylor would be lifelong. No amount of time could ever fully erase the trauma of losing her mother and coming to terms with the truth about Steven. The man she had once called Uncle Steven, the man who had filled the role of a father in her life, was now the person responsible for the greatest loss she could ever experience. As she grew older, the questions would linger. Why had Steven done it? What had pushed him to kill the woman he had once cared for? Would she ever be able to forgive him? And could she ever trust anyone again in the same way? For the family, the trauma of losing Susan was compounded by the fact that the man who had taken her life was someone they had all once considered a part of their inner circle. The loss was not just of a loved one, it was the loss of the safety and trust that comes with family. The very structure of the family had been shattered, and no amount of time would ever return things to the way they had been before. In the end, the case was closed, but the impact of Susan's death would be felt forever. Taylor had lost not only her mother, but the father figure she had once trusted. The betrayal she would feel would be something that would haunt her as she navigated life without Susan. Keith and Anthony were left to pick up the pieces of their broken family, knowing that no amount of time would ever heal the wounds they had suffered. And Steven, now incarcerated, would have to live with the fact that his actions had destroyed not only Susan's life, but the lives of everyone who had once cared for her. The questions that remained were not easily answered. What drove Steven to commit such an unspeakable act? Was it the pressure of his double life, the jealousy, the rivalry with his brother, or the burden of the pregnancies? And what lasting impact would his crime have on the family he tore apart? These questions lingered, unanswered, as the family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, forever marked by the tragedy that Steven had caused.